Hello, everyone. I am Professor Vivi Kefala, and I have the pleasure to present you tonight Professor Ebtisam Hussein. She's an academic council member at European Neighborhood Council and associate professor of political science at Cairo University on full secondment. She served as associate professor of Middle Eastern Studies from February 2019 to January 2022 at Sun Yat-sen University, one of China's top 10 universities. Ebtisam Hussein serves, as I said, as associate professor at New Giza University. She holds her PhD in 2014 from the Free University of Berlin, and her research is focused on Egyptian politics, Islamism, repressive practices in the public sphere, and post-2011 Middle East, North Africa political landscapes. In addition to her published peer-reviewed research, she recently contributed analysis papers available on the ENC website. During her career path, she was awarded several international scholarships, such as the Cultural Exchange Program in Japan in 2005, a Fulbright grant to study US politics and thought in 2006. Ebtisam Hussein recently has visited the Department of Social Sciences at Freiburg University for a one-month research stay funded by SNSF, where she engaged in a joint research project with Professor Ansgar Jodik. Sorry, I don't speak German, from the Religious Studies Department on Islamists in the public sphere. Professor Hussein, the floor is yours.
Thanks much for the introduction and for having me here, Professor Charalampos. I thank the audience also for being here. This is the first time for me in Greece, so it's not pure work. It's also like seeing the country and exploring the other Mediterranean cultures. It's very special for me to be here because of several considerations, but I won't put too much time into that. But this is the first time for me to present the analysis. Like most of my other publications, I presented even more than once sometimes. So this is the first time that I present this analysis. And the topic is very relevant because for the last 20 years, there was the concern and the scholarly attention paid to militancy, and specifically to Islamist militancy. I come from the Middle East. I'm Muslim by birth. I speak Arabic. So it was quite intriguing for me to write on the topic. I remember very well when I visited the United States in 2006. Back then it was something to look Middle Eastern because the memory of 9/11 was still vivid, it was still fresh. And I never stayed away from the study of Islam. Like my PhD was contemporary Islamic political discourse. And I published in Arabic on Egyptian Islamists. I have a paper in the pipeline on the Muslim Brotherhood. So I have, like, I never left my concern and my interest in the study of political Islam. I'll start the PowerPoint so that we have a bit more time for the audience to ask later on. This is a little bit of mapping. Yes, one thing is why it's relevant. This is part and parcel of any presentation that I do, is like, why should we be sitting here together and discussing this? And then I move from that to how is Islamist militancy today? And how is it in MENA? Like, we are concerned with MENA Islamist militancy, but this doesn't have to be solely in the MENA region. So we talk about it like when it comes to Europe, and then we discuss it also in MENA, because this is relevant because at the end I mean, the analysis that I'm discussing today was actually about how the European Union deals with Islamist militancy and what the stakes and the challenges are. And then I speak a bit of numbers. And this is this is something I did last night. Like, you will not find the numbers part of the PowerPoint in the analysis that's published in a PDF on the ENC website. And I did it last night because I thought it is not just relevant, but if democracy and terrorism are put together as either or it's like, okay, if you concern too much for democracy, maybe you will risk having terrorist attacks coming from MENA. And the other way around, that if you are too strict on terrorism, maybe you will be sacrificing a bit democratic norms and values. So I went to the indexes, the Global Democracy Index and the Global Terrorism Index, and I got the numbers for Arab MENA countries, excluding, I mean, here when I say MENA, I exclude Mauritania, Palestine, for special reasons. Like, there are different definitions of the Arab, like Arab countries, like the Middle East, like how you define where the contours are. So I went for the numbers for 2011, 2016, and 2021, because I wanted to see where the countries started in 2011 and where they ended in 2021. Are they better off or worse in terms of democracy and terrorism? And I think you will like this part, but let's not just rush. And the numbers brings us to the general features, or kind of what the numbers are telling us about MENA in democracy and terrorism. And then we come to the EU, what they are doing in order to promote democracy, to combat terrorism, and what are the stakes and the challenges. Well, what do they tell is actually the numbers, not the EU. So it's an edit. I'll do it later. So why is it relevant that we are concerned to study, to explore Islamist militancy today? Frankly, this is something that is not because of the MENA uprisings. This is not something that we can argue started with the MENA uprisings. It was there. We had the 9/11 in the United States. We had the 2004 Madrid train attack. And we had the London 7/7 of 2005, the suicide bombings that were simultaneously occurring in London. So we know before 2011, before the MENA uprisings, that terrorists could work across countries, that they can coordinate their actions with the help of people inside democratic, open societies. And we know that their attacks result in casualties, and casualties here are like people who die. The casualties are both the injured and the dead. And of course, not to speak about the infrastructure destruction and the amount of money, the billions that were spent over the years inside the EU and also from the United States in order to combat terrorism, in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So, I don't know why it's skipping. Okay. I have to do it manually.
I'm afraid it's frozen.
Well, if I use the arrows, it's better. Yes. So, then came 2011, the MENA uprisings, the euphoria of democracy, the spillover, the domino effect, the fact that one country, Tunisia, started the protests and then suddenly a long-term autocrat was ousted. Then came Egypt. Then it happened in Libya. It was very, it was overwhelming to see how the domino effect kind of actualized in the MENA in 2011. Still, the political vacuum that resulted from the MENA uprisings was beyond controversy. Like, this is not something we can argue about. In many countries where the ousters took place, there was a political vacuum, and the security establishment, regardless of how efficient or transparent or disciplined that security establishment was, security establishments were in pieces. Like, they were really not functioning properly in many MENA uprising countries, or what I call the post-MENA uprising countries. This meant that if there are terrorists working inside these countries, they had a chance to thrive because of the fact that they can get away with training, with meeting, with even smuggling weapons. And that was a concern. And it didn't take much effort in order to tell that terrorism was actually thriving after 2011 across the countries of the MENA. I mean, we had Syria, Libya, and Yemen, at least 3 countries with prolonged internal conflict with arms involved. So militant groups were there, were active, were defying the state in many instances. They were working across borders, and they were training militants to work and carry out attacks in other countries. The 2 stark instances where Europe could actually sense the impact of the security challenges in post-MENA countries were the 2015 Paris attacks and the 2016 Brussels attacks. In November 2015, Paris had a very tragic attack by ISIS militants. They orchestrated and carried out several simultaneous attacks on the Bataclan concert hall, a stadium, bars, and restaurants, killing more than 100 people. And it turned out that they were planned in Syria by ISIS. So many of the culprits, they happened to receive training in Syria by ISIS, like, I wouldn't call them calibers, but kind of the trainers, they were in Syria, and somehow the state security or the intelligence in France kind of underrated the fact that these people were traveling to Syria at a time where Syria was in political turmoil. In March 2016 was the Belgium attack. Its international airport and a metro station were simultaneously attacked with bombs, and ISIS claimed responsibility for both. At that time, Belgium, and this is ironic, was the highest in number of Islamist groups recruits per capita in Western Europe. This means they had, relative to the number of the population, the highest number of Islamist groups. The people who carried out the attacks in Belgium were actually citizens, but they came from MENA origins, like their parents came from MENA countries. And again, they received training, they were coordinating with people in the Middle East at that time. The profiles of the culprits weren't so different from that of the Paris attacks. Okay, so we had these 2 stark instances, and we knew from the investigations and from the trials and the hearings that the culprits were actually, they had to do with MENA at that time, especially Syria. But on the other hand, MENA was not free of terrorism. You cannot, if you have terrorist groups thriving, you cannot just, or you cannot predict that they're going to work against Europe, but they're not going to work against their own countries, or they're going to work in the country where they live, but not in the neighboring countries. It's very, wouldn't say volatile, but it's kind of unpredictable. You cannot just tell where their next attack is going to be. So In Egypt, there was the tragic 2012 soccer game massacre where people were locked into a stadium, and then there were brutal attacks. So many people died. And after Morsi's ouster in 2013, there was an upsurge in the number of militant attacks in Sinai, in Egypt. Yemen was, of course, in a much worse situation because of the civil war, and Syria, the same, because of the fact that the opposition was armed. It was not just opposition like in the sense of civil and non-violent opposition. Libya was divided between the government of national accord and the National Liberation Army, and this took years until they finally came to some sort of agreement by the late 2020. Yeah, so both ways, militants were making use, were taking opportunity of the fact that the security situation was not optimal in many post-uprising MENA countries. And this could be, this resonated in Europe in terms of the kind of attacks that were encountered. So let me now talk about the numbers that I was talking about, because, okay, we know that some countries had strong upheaval. Some other countries just had the ousters and then things went smooth. And some other countries actually didn't have, or almost didn't have anything different before and after the uprisings. Like you have the monarchies of the Arab Peninsula. They were the least affected, except of course for Yemen. But I mean the Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, I mean, they kind of learned from what happened to the other countries, to the republics, and they adapted. But again, you had in 2019 other countries, specifically 3 countries. You had Algeria and Libya, Algeria, Sudan, and Lebanon, sorry. These 3 countries, they had serious and significant upheaval that resulted in ousters in both Algeria and Sudan. So before 2019, you could simply talk about post-2011 MENA. But after 2019, you know that there was a second wave. And again, not all the countries were affected in 2011, and not all the countries were affected in 2019. So reading these numbers is not easy. We're going to talk about the trends and what they tell us, but, and forgive, of course, that it's not a table. But some things make sense. Like, for example, if you compare, you see it here, right? If you compare Libya, Yemen, and Syria, the countries which had the strongest upheaval and armed conflict after in 2011, you will find that their numbers in 2016 were quite close. 155, 156, and 166. These are from the Global Democracy Index. But at a point, when you look at Libya in 2011, it's 125, and you look at the monarchies, and you find that the same year Kuwait was 122, you're like, oh, but there was a big difference in terms of the stability inside the country. This, I pinpoint this example because I want to say that the democracy index is not about the uprisings. Yeah? So if a country is democratic or not is more or less about the commitment to rule of law, to the checks and balances, to the idea of free and fair elections. And if the uprising did not result in the state itself committing atrocities against civilians, then this shouldn't necessarily translate into a worsening of its ranking on democracy. But yet again, if you look at these numbers, and you're going to have the PowerPoint later on, I will do some edits, but I mean, if you compare the numbers here, you will see there is some logic. Why do I put them in the order, in such an order? Because, for example, Egypt and Tunisia were the countries that had similar trajectories in terms of a short uprising, a short-time uprising, resulting in an ouster of a long-term dictator. But then, of course, this is different from Libya, Yemen, and Syria, which had a prolonged, even that Libya had an ouster, but still they were different because they had a prolonged armed conflict starting 2011. Iraq is a special case because of the 2003, I mean, post the American invasion. So I put it alone, and you will see that it's different even in its ranking. The monarchies are together. I mean, now I'm talking about Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE. They are together in the 6 monarchies. They are together because they are really different in terms of what happened in 2011 and how they were affected. And you will see that their numbers are quite similar, okay? And that actually they play within a range of 120 and 150, the ranking. Okay, so let's now talk about a bit of trends before I go to the terrorism. First of all, you will see that not all of the variations are significant. What does this mean? You will find that some countries changed slightly, like Iraq on the terrorism, this is just an example, turned from the first place in the world in terms of highest level of terrorism in 2011, turning to the second in 10 years. In 2021, it turned slightly from the first to the second. So this is something that's, okay, it is a variation, but it's not a significant one. You will see other countries with a variation that is 10 points or 20 points. So you need to consider the fact that not all variations are the same. The other thing that's very peculiar about MENA Arab countries on the Global Democracy Index is actually that you will find Tunisia always taking first place. So if you check the index, starting from up to down, and up one is the best and going down, you'll find Tunisia coming always high relatively to other Arab countries, and it will take you a while until you find the next Arab country. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. No one Arab country you will find within the top 50 or even the 60. So if you check the numbers again on the slide, on the one before, you will find that no one of them is, for example, 58 or 45. Usually they come later. And this tells something about the persistence of autocratic regimes. If I take Yemen out, because Yemen is in the Arab Peninsula, not because it's a monarchy, the ranges will be 120 to 150, as I just said, and some numbers easily mirror the uprising trajectories and others not. As I said, why should Libya be 125 in 2011 while Kuwait is 122? At the same time, this brings us to the idea that it's not easy to contextualize these numbers. That, for example, what happened in Libya, the ouster and killing of Gaddafi, didn't happen early on in 2011. This is different from Tunisia and Egypt. So you cannot easily tell how the uprisings affect the index if the state is actually involved in the violence. The other thing, of course, Iraq is a special case with the post-US invasion. It's not about what the uprisings did to Iraq, okay? And again, Lebanon, Algeria, and Sudan, they had their upheaval, their significant upheaval in 2019 and not in 2011. So all that should actually be kept in mind while reading these numbers. The one thing, I will go back to the numbers because I need to show you something. I hope I'm not taking too long. The exclamation marks that I use here are actually to tell that they are going down. See, Libya moved in 2011 from 84 to 26 in 2021. So they are actually, oh, sorry, this is the terrorism. I'm sorry, this is the terrorism one. Yeah, Libya went from why is it? Okay, it went from 125 to 154. This means it's getting worse. Like its democracy is deteriorating, okay? Yemen, the same, Syria, the same. This tells something, okay? The countries with a prolonged armed conflict actually ended up in 2021 in a worse situation compared to their democracy index in 2011. Now, if you put the numbers together, if you add up, forget about the monarchies, and then you will see that 4 countries got better, the ones with the dashes next to them, and the ones 6 versus 6, getting worse. And even one of the 4 that are getting better, which is Tunisia, I put the question marks, because Tunisia, after the the July 2021 ouster of the government, is expected in 2022 to go down on its global democracy index. So looking at the numbers, like ending up till 2021, actually tells that Tunisia is getting better. But this is a bit skeptic, or we are a bit skeptic to that. Jordan, this is peculiar. Jordan actually stayed roughly the same over the, like, if you compare 2011, 2016, and 2018, 21. It stayed 118, okay? So we turn to, you will have the PowerPoint. I will not delve in deeper with the democracy trends. Let's move to the terrorism trends. The terrorism trends is that, of course, as expected, you will find the ranking of Libya, Yemen, and Syria is high. And high here is different from the Global Democracy Index, because if you rank 1, this means you're in a very bad situation in terms of terrorism, okay? And if you have a bigger number, then you're doing good. The interesting part is that the monarchies, the 6 monarchies, are doing really good in general in terms of terrorism. They are safe. You will see that, for example, in 2011, on the rank 113 is actually 0, is a score of 0. And you will see that both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates had that score, were 113. Qatar, throughout 2011, 2016, and 2021, had a score of 0. Can you imagine? I mean, it's very common in the Arab monarchies to have a good score, a very good score, actually, one of the best globally in terms of terrorism. This is, of course, not the case with Syria, with Yemen, with Libya. And the funny part is Jordan. Jordan, that stayed with democracy, actually is like, it's getting worse in terms of terrorism. It moved from 73 to 58. This means the higher the rank on the global terrorism index, the worse the situation is, okay? Yeah, so, I mean, I don't want to take much time because there are so many things to say about these numbers, but one good thing is that the uprisings of 2019 are actually, I wouldn't say associated because I don't have the numbers for that, but you will see that Algeria and Sudan are doing better on democracy and they are doing better on terrorism. And when it comes to the numbers that we're moving on terrorism, it was roughly, if you take Iraq out, we take one country out and then it's 5 versus 5. Like 5 got better and 5 got worse. Okay. Okay, I'll leave that here. You can read that later because one last thing on the numbers is actually that if you put the countries which had a strong alteration in 2011, that is Egypt, Tunisia, along with Yemen, Syria, and Libya, you will find that all got worse except for Tunisia on democracy, and all got worse except for Yemen on terrorism. Now we turn to the EU and what they're doing in order to combat terrorism. Spending billions, trying to harmonize definitions of terrorism. Yes, we know that it is the responsibility of individual EU countries to take care of their own domestic security, but the EU is still making the effort, border protection, regulating firearms, information data sharing, and most recently, the EU invested heavily in internet control. You know, the things that, like the measures that were taken after the 9/11, when you talk over the phone and the one word is used, and then this triggers the inspection of the call and the recording. Something like that is going on now with the internet, so that they wouldn't let people inside the EU who are interested in terrorist ideas be easily recruited by militants outside the EU, and the other way around. So chats and conversations over the internet, your searches, if you search something that's violent, if the chat is violent, then they will be monitored, and probably there will be measures taken. So this is, and they invested heavily in cybersecurity and the regulation on the dissemination of terrorist content online. Okay. This brings me to the question, the one that the whole thing is about. Is the EU really doing a good job combating terrorism? We know that, realistically speaking, eliminating or eradicating terrorism is not that easy. It's like, I wouldn't say it's in the air, but we're talking about civilians who are attracted to violent ideas, who can actually orchestrate and carry out their attacks without buying guns. Something like what happened in 9/11. They just forged falsified passports and took the aeroplane and crashed into the towers. So, or for example, those who roll over using trucks in mass gatherings and so on. So terrorism is there, and the ambition is actually to reduce it to the least possible ever. Like foiling the attempts is actually one big achievement and success. But the problem that the EU is actually facing today, and this is my analysis, the one that I published last year, is that the EU needs to address the underlying factors leading to the thriving of terrorism in MENA. We're talking about justice, we're talking about allocation of resources, more egalitarian or like efficient, so to say, allocation of resources. We're talking about poverty, eradicating poverty. So if people are still poor, suffering from economic hardships, no chances for social mobility, then militants will always have a soil to thrive. And the EU is trying to help with development, but yet again, if the concern for combating terrorism takes over, then autocratic regimes will make use of that in order to restrict freedoms and rights. This brings us again to the vicious cycle of militants using the repressive measures, something like what in 9/11 used to be why they hate us. Like, why did they attack the United States? It's a land of freedom. Yes, but the United States was regarded as a country that supports autocratic regimes. So the EU is really stuck with this equation. Do more in order to combat the underlying factors, this is important, but at the same time, do not turn a blind eye on repressive measures at the hope that these repressive regimes will actually control the flow, the influx of terrorism to Europe. And I don't think this is something that's going to be a question of today or because of the MENA uprisings or before that or after that, it's going to stay. The more the EU puts priority on controlling the influx of terrorists from the MENA region, the more it will be open to overlooking repressive practices in MENA. I've taken too long, and I hope you will, I said something that was new to you, and I'm open to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. It was Professor Hussein. It was very interesting. Do you hear me? Well, Professor Hussein, thank you for your speech. It was very interesting and very intriguing in some points. But now it's time for comments, questions. Please say your name and your affiliation if you're a scholar or a student. And Professor Tsardanidis has a comment or a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this challenging lecture. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks.
And I would like to comment in your second part, which was the, not the big one, not the big stuff about the European Union policy. I'm writing a book on Euro-Mediterranean relationship, but one of the chapters is the Europe's neighborhood policy, the southern dimension, in other words, towards Mediterranean and mainly Arab plus Israel states. I would, you conclude your lecture by saying the more the European Union takes a priority or puts priority to counter terrorism, the more there is a danger of ignoring other priorities, and one of them is democratic development and the regimes which almost in all Arab states are not, we are not very proud of their democratic principles. I think that one of my conclusions and my assessment is that this has already been done. That Europe is giving high priority, not now, but for a few years now, the priority to security. Whatever you could include in this term, and of course is of avoiding against the terrorist attacks in European soil. It isn't like before. The paradigm has changed. In order to develop the South Mediterranean states, in order to contain, for example, radicalism. Now, the paradigm is our priority, is our security, I mean the European security. So I'm afraid that it's not a matter of future. This is the real policy nowadays of the European Union, and sometimes it's a little bit hypocritical. For example, they don't care about developing democracy, although they're saying about that. They have very close contacts with authoritarian regimes due to the security dimension, and they try, by these links with these regimes, to contain terrorism. I don't know if they succeed or not, but I am afraid that the paradigm has changed. This is my comment, okay? Thank you. Other question? May I ask? You have the floor.
Well, Professor Sakas has a comment, okay.
Professor Hussein, thank you very much.
Excuse me, would you like to answer or to get? Okay.
Yes. So I have just two questions. The first question, thank you very much for your lecture.
Oh, thanks.
Very interesting presentation. The first question is about this Islamic militancy and terrorism. I want your opinion, your personal opinion, because you are from that place, from the Middle East, and you from the Egypt. So I want to know your opinion about what do you think are the basic reasons of this terrorism? The basic reasons are, for example, economic reasons, like you mentioned poverty before, are political reasons, or even religion reasons. Is there any connection between these reasons? You mentioned about poverty, that I'm thinking, for example, that in South America, in Brazil, in Peru, in Bolivia, there is poverty, but there's no militancy. There's another kind of militancy there, but not religious militancy. So can we blame poverty, just poverty, for this terrorism, Islamic terrorism, just poverty? Or there are also other reasons, mixed reasons, like political ones, the West, maybe the role of the West, or religion reasons, maybe. I want your personal opinion. And the other one is about my comment about the European Union. It's because sometimes I'm working in Brussels, and we make plans about the policy of the European Union towards the Middle East. So I think that the European Union makes a lot of effort as an evaluator of European projects, especially on Horizon. So we talk a lot there as a committee of making projects and evaluating projects. We make comments on the situation in the Middle East and how European Union could improve its policy towards the Middle East. But my personal impression is that the European Union devotes a lot of effort to improve the situation there with regard to poverty, human rights, democracy. But, you know, it's not easy to do that because you need the cooperation of the societies of the Middle East and the governments of the Middle East. And this cooperation is not easy to have. So I think the approach of the European Union is the right one. It's much better than the American one, for example. Because even the Americans want to make changes in the Middle East with regard to democracy, but they try to impose their will, I think. The Americans try to impose their will. Why the European Union adopts a soft policy towards the Middle East? This is my impression, and this is the right policy. I'm only critical with regard to that sometimes the European Union adopts an above-below policy, a top-below policy. Try sometimes, even the European Union, like the Americans, to impose their will to the people, to the society, sometimes.
You won't say less than optimal policies?
Yes. Okay. So I think we may be critical of the European Union policy. It must change and become more cooperative towards the Middle East. But as I said before, it also depends on how the Middle East societies and governments react to this European policy. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other comments, question? No, for the moment. I'd like to. Do you have any question? Please, do. to speak, to discuss among us. It's okay, it's fine, but you're here, please.
Maybe I can answer the questions, and then maybe they will reflect on that. Okay. First, security comes first. Even if, okay, would you care too much for security that you will sacrifice everything else for it? This is something, again, as we just said by the end of the lecture, this is something that's not going to be a question of today because of the MENA uprisings or 9/11, 2001. It's going to be forever. Like, this is something that is like cost and benefit. It's like how much you earn and how much. It's a zero-sum game. Yeah, you cannot easily say, I'm going to care for security and I'm not going to give up on democracy. The problem, the real problem, is that the EU believes that this is the easiest way to cooperate with ruling regimes in MENA countries in order to suppress the influx, to inhibit the influx of terrorists, okay? And we have to be honest, it's not just an influx of terrorists, but also of refugees. And we all know about how the influx of refugees have posed some threats to the EU as a regional constellation that actually many countries were considering. Forget about Brexit. I mean, Brexit is a special case. But if you talk about the other countries that where you have the far right on the rise, where you have serious talks and discussions about whether there should be referenda on leaving the EU. So the EU is also obliged to maintain itself. They want to continue to be there. And as long as the EU thinks that cooperation with ruling regimes means, in order to suppress the influx of terrorists and refugees, that actually this means to let go or overlook repressive practices, this is never going to change. Like, it's one thing to cooperate in one field. It's like to have the concern and to make the effort in order to inhibit the influx of terrorists and refugees. Of course, not end as equal, but end like a different file. But at the same time, to put pressure in order for MENA countries to democratize, to promote their democracy. There was the chance in 2011, many countries to have genuine democratic schemes and trajectories because of the fall, because of the ouster of long-time dictators. Again, it was very critical for the EU to stop the influx of terrorists in order to make sure that things get better. But they did that the way, I mean the EU policymakers, they did that the way they saw best. They saw optimal. We say that it's less than optimal because we think there is more they can do. This is why we're discussing this, because we think that maybe more pressure can be applied. We know that the EU has funds and that many MENA countries receive these funds. They need these funds in order to improve their infrastructure, the developmental projects to be carried out, and the EU is not using that as a card in terms of democracy promotion. Okay? And this brings me to answer your question or your comments in terms of the factors leading to terrorism. Remember, in the presentation, I mentioned that the monarchies of the Arab Peninsula are actually doing, many of them are doing great in terms of safety. It was amazing for me last night when I was like, oh my God, Qatar stayed all throughout the 3 years that I detected, it stayed zero. And it's not the only one country that stayed zero. By the way, in 2021, there were 4 of them. There were 4 of them with a zero. I think they were the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. So either they were good in 2011 and they stayed good, or they got even better in 2021. If it is religion, you know how conservative these societies are, the monarchies, the ones within the brackets. And religion plays a role, but still they are safe societies. So you cannot really correlate the faith or the believing in a religious doctrine and committing violence. In all religions there were, forget about the numbers, I mean how many people really take guns and go and carry out. The idea of using violence was there in many faiths, in many religions. This is not something that's easy to tell, oh, well, maybe it is something with the faith. But the underlying factors like the poverty, and I use more numbers on that in the ENC analysis that was published last year about the number of people who are in abject poverty, the number of people who are under poverty line in MENA countries. So there are still millions of people who are poor. There is still significant concentration of wealth. And we're not saying that the EU should actually take money and give it to the poor. We're just saying that if they are making the effort to improve people's lives, they need to make sure that they are doing that optimally, that they are doing that in an optimal way, not in a less than optimal way. Again, the whole thing this brings us back to the repression part. So if people are suffering and they feel their voices are not heard, then there is a chance for militants to thrive. It's all about drying up the swamps. It's really about making sure that militants cannot easily recruit people. And if people have chances for social mobility, they have something to care for, like a life, I wouldn't say a prosperous life, but a decent life. You have a safe place where you, a roof over your head, so to say. You have the security for basic needs. This is how militants cannot thrive. Because if they tell someone, oh, come and let's do the attack, oh, why would I do the attack? I have a life. So again, the poverty combined with repressive measures is actually a combination that's not so good when it comes to militants proliferating their ideas and their practices, coordinating with other people. I'm really impressed by the amount of effort that the EU is exerting in terms not just the money, but also the measures that are taken in order to combat terrorism. But let's see if this will actually work. At a point, honestly, I think what Professor Charalampous said is quite accurate. Maybe after 2015 and 2016, the Belgium and French attacks, the Belgium and France attacks, the EU thought differently. They thought, okay, it's not just about the cybersecurity or definitions of terrorism, harmonizing them, regulating firearms. We need to suppress the influx of terrorists, and this is easiest done through coordination with ruling regimes, regardless of these regimes are democratic, democratizing, like regardless of the regime type. We need to work together with these countries in order to make sure that the terrorists do not come and attack our citizens.
Well, thank you. Any of you? We don't have any question on the chat. Yes, okay. Please. Your name?
I'm Rimi. I'm a postgraduate student of international relations in the University of Athens. And I would like to maybe ask you to elaborate a bit more on the over-securitization of policies within the states at hand. You know, I can think of Tunisia, I can think of Egypt, for instance, and how have they actually affected terrorism within these countries? Have they helped diminish it or, I don't know, enhance it? Yeah, let's maybe comment on that.
Okay.
On the micro level.
This would need numbers. Yesterday, I checked the numbers for the Global Democracy Index and the Global Terrorism Index. I wouldn't be able to answer that without some numbers, but for like me living in Egypt, I do think that terrorism is, I mean, in terms of number of incidents, is on a decline. This is different from back then in 2013, 14, 15, things were really like you would hear about an incident in Sinai every couple of weeks. This is not happening anymore. I mean, they are in control. The internal, the domestic security measures are actually bearing fruit. But again, you have a situation where militants are thriving and you need to make sure that citizens are safe. Because if you lose the safety part, the element of safety in life, you cannot simply function. How would you plan for your PhD? Or how would you go on a ride? Or how would you actually go to work to make a living if you are worried? And this is how terrorists work. They kind of sabotage the system. They want to disrupt it. So at one point, even if you're working on the underlying factors, the development part, still you are stuck with the fact that there are militants who are engaging, carrying out, recruiting people in order to orchestrate militant attacks. I don't know about other countries, but I do think that in Egypt there was a decline, a significant decline in the number of incidents. But by the way, the Global Terrorism Index, the one that I use here, or the one that I used to make the comparisons, it does not solely depend on the number of incidents. It also depends on, so the incidents, the fatalities, the casualties, and the damage to the infrastructure. It's an indicator that's combined. So when we say 0 in many Arab monarchies, it's not just 0 incidents. It's like incidents, like the score combined is 0, which is the safest. Again, it was amazing for me to see that.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was really, really informative. My name is Androniki. I am from the Faculty of Turkish and Modern Asian Studies of Kappadocian University, and I also studied Islamic Studies in the University of Frankfurt, in Goethe University. And I have actually a double question for you. One of that is, since the terroristic brotherhoods, if I can say it like this, or other kind of terroristic groups have been evolved since many years in the MENA regions, and especially and also in Egypt, we see with Islamic brotherhoods from the period of Nasser and afterwards, it goes really, really far away. What does these countries do in order to prevent terroristic militancy? And this is the one question. And the second one is regarding Europe. I think that after 2015 and 2016, not only because of the incidents of Paris and Brussels, but also because of the refugees waves, the whole Islamophobia, if I can accept the term, and the whole fear towards Muslim people has raised wildly. And towards the security, I think that Europe is like tries to prevent that, but doesn't really try, because we have seen like many people from the population actually getting involved in these kind of groups, and that was like really huge for the European status and history, for many Christians or Catholics or Protestants to get involved, not only in Muslim groups, but terroristic Muslim groups. And I don't really think that there's any educational-wise standards towards like Islam religion in general, not towards terrorist attacks and yeah. Okay.
Let me take first. You said you wanted to know the efforts that are made or exerted by the countries which have Islamist militants.
Yeah, if there is any.
Yeah. Well, Islamist groups are part of the region because of many factors, including the fact that for long decades, the countries, like here I'm talking about the governments, were not doing the best job in terms of offering basic services and goods. It's very important to point out that many Islamist groups thrive. I'm talking now Islamist groups, not necessarily violent ones. Islamist groups usually thrive on the lack or shortage of basic needs and services because they step in and do part of the job. They offer things for free, for reduced prices, and this is very important for the poor. If you don't have the money to go to the doctor and they pay for that, or if you don't have money to take some blood tests and they do that for you, and so on and so forth. So they have been entrenched in the society and the societies here in MENA for so long because of the fact that there was a shortage, some shortage in basic needs and services. Plus the fact that, historically speaking, religion was very important and an integral factor in the evolution of the ruling regimes in many Arab countries. Like the monarchies, you know, Saudi Arabia is like...
Even Jordan.
Yeah, sure. Jordan, Morocco, and I mean...
Morocco, par excellence.
The idea that they relate to the religion in a very close and way and overt way is part of the legitimacy of the regimes. And the societies, the culture is very important to the daily life of people, how they act. And you know, the Muslim brothers under Mubarak, even before the uprising, forget about, I mean, their victories in electoral competitions after the uprisings. Even under Mubarak, under all the kind of repressive measures that were imposed, they made it to the 2005 parliament with 88 seats. I mean, this can tell you how strong the grassroots base was. So, back to your question when it comes to militancy. Again, the problem is that once you have militants and you have terrorist attacks, the government is obliged towards its citizens for basic safety and security, because without it, nothing works. Really, nothing works. You cannot, like, maybe we can virtually imagine if no one is really secure to go out of their place, like of their house. Nothing works. No education, no investment, no work, nothing. You will have nothing because everyone is afraid all the time that they would die. So there will be, of course, state security and putting people in jail who are like engaged in such activities. But again, when we say drying up the swamps and dealing with the underlying factors, this is the key to not just development, but also to inhibiting, to eradicating militant groups from these countries. It's not through prioritizing security, overlooking democracy promotion when we're talking about EU policy towards the Middle East and North Africa. So the numbers tell us that many countries are like, there is nothing as everyone is getting worse, and there is nothing like everyone is getting better. But you can easily tell that, yes, the countries which had the prolonged armed struggles, like Yemen, Libya, and Syria, they were not doing good in terms of democracy. You can tell that things are getting worse. So this kind of rings a bell. You need stability in order, of course, to have democracy promotion. You cannot have armed struggle and at the same time work on enhancing or adopting a democratic regime. The EU has a role, and the ruling regimes, they have a role. The uniting part is, or the kind of the thing that we all agree about, is that no one wants terrorism, right? No one wants terrorist attacks or terrorist groups to thrive, of course. But how this is done, this is what we're discussing. Like, is really the EU doing the job that it needs to do optimally, as just said? Has it been done optimally or not? Okay, so this is one thing. And then when you said about religion and its relation, I do agree. Religion, it doesn't really play a role if you're Muslim, if you're Christian, if you're Jewish, that you would be inclined to attack other people or to inflict pain on others. We know all over the world that there are Muslims who stand against terrorism, that they feel for the people who die, that they stand in solidarity with the societies that are under attack. But again, militants thrive on the hardships, on the suffering of ordinary citizens everywhere. You're welcome.
Any other question or comment? Well, I'd like to to say that I agree with Professor Hussein. Islam there is Islamophobia. And Islam is not a religion special devoted to violence. And being Muslim, I'm Christian by birth. So I don't have any reason to defend any other religion or the religion and that's all. So I'm saying that there is really the idea that violence and Islam are two faces of the same coin, which is not true. Being Muslim doesn't mean that you are a terrorist to be, or someone violent. But on the other hand, we have a really strong influence of Muslim Brotherhood being birthed in Egypt, the second decade of 20th century. But that was something different. You have the West oppressing, exploding, exploitation of the West, of the colonists, and we have the post-colonial present, which is not finished. These countries, give you an example. Algeria became an independent state in 1962. Kuwait became independent in 1971, if I remember well. And there is another state in the Gulf region which became independent in 1981. 1981, meaning 60 years. How much is it?
Well, this is 40.
40 years.
90, yeah, 40 years.
40 years. They don't still have the time to understand what happened. Well, Islamist then has attraction, and there are too many people, especially in Egypt. Why? Because Muslim Brotherhood was helped by Saudi Arabia just to fight Nasser. This was the Islamic Cold War, as we call it. And now it happens exactly the opposite. Saudi Arabia, who does not control Muslim Brotherhood anymore, says it's a terrorist organization. That would be funny if it wouldn't be so important and tragic in a way, right? Well, my remark is, final remark is, violence and Islam are not two identical notions. Please keep that in mind. Professor Tsadanidis wanted to...
Yes, sorry. Microphone, please. Thank you. I would like to ask you the following question. If there is any relevance to your approach between radicalization, democratic process, and militancy. Because what we're observing is that in some Arab countries, there is populist movements. One of them I consider the Muslim Brothers. There are also others in other countries, like Hamas, for example, which with the Western standards of democracy, they manage to take power through democratic process. they want the majority of the people. For example, in Palestine, there was no any, as far as I know, observation that Hamas did not win the elections. And there were many observers from the West as well. So, as you are a political analyst and political scientist, is there any problem in your approach of how to deal with these problems of this issue? On the one hand, you have to accept the democratic process. On the other hand, through this democratic process, we are observing the radicalization of the new regimes, and through that, perhaps, militancy is emerging. Not only as a reason what you have already pointed out through the repression of the regime, but also through the manifestation and the victory of this democratic, let's say, through the democratic process, not the democratic governments. I don't say that they believe in democratic principles, but through the process, underlying the process. And do you think that there is a problem in the analysis of coordinating radicalization, populism, and militarism?
And that's a very interesting question. You know, we're in Greece, Athens, the direct democracy, and democracy is the rule of the demagogues. The thing about demo, that actually it's not just bewildering, it's puzzling. What if you have a population that is radicalized, that would bring to power, if you have a democratic setting, radical ruling regimes, right? But this is very basic, this kind of understanding that, okay, maybe societies that are radicalized, they want to have radicalized or radical ruling groups. Because when you have democracy in a society that was long repressed, of course, there were groups benefiting from the repression, benefiting from shortages in basic needs and services. And when you have a democratic setting, it goes without saying that they will thrive. And this is the dilemma. Would you allow democratic settings to allow groups whom you know beforehand that they are radical, to take power, to take over, just because you're committed to the rules of the democratic game? Or would you sabotage and interrupt democracy because you know beforehand that these people will not commit to democracy? This has been going on. Again, I wouldn't overdo the MENA uprisings. I wouldn't say the MENA uprisings brought us to these kinds of questions. Actually, they were there. Remember, democracy without Democrats. This has been part of the literature for so long. The idea that maybe there are groups, political groups, who do not believe in democracy, who can make something out of democratic rules, but they are not committed to democracy. And then we say democracy once and for all, that they would reach power through democratic settings and then let no one else get to power. There will be no alternation of power. Here is the thing, and it's a choice. If a country, A, B, C, forget about the MENA, I mean, now virtually any country in the world which is autocratic, thinks along these lines, no country will turn democratic. If you're always worried about which group is going to reach power, if you allow democracy, then it's done. Because again, democracy is the commitment to the rules of the game. This is when we tell democracy works. If you have an uprising, if you have a revolution or even a military coup, and then the regime is reshuffled, and then you have elections, how do you tell that you have a democracy or not? if people commit, if the key players commit to the rules of the democratic game. I know it's easier said than done, but we can think about a way out, which is, but I wouldn't now confine it or speak about it as for Islamists. Schwedler's theory about the inclusion moderation theory, that if you include political players, they lose their drive to radicalize, to be radical. Because actually, populism and radicalization is a way of attracting an audience, right? So if you're included in the political game and you know you have something to offer, why would you go radical? We all know that the far right was thriving for years inside the EU member states because of the fact that people, ordinary citizens, were not happy about the influx of refugees. And they were making something out of it. Okay? So, to be happy about refugees or not, we know that they are included. You do not sabotage European democracies because you have the far right. You can always put prohibitions on ideas promoting violence. You can say you can do whatever you want, you can advocate whatever you want to advocate, but you cannot advocate violence. You can put in jail those who commit violence for political purposes. That's legal, that's legitimate. But you do not sabotage a democracy because of that, because you're worried that people would follow them. If they have something that is represented in society, think about what makes people go and follow far-right groups and work on that. So, again, the whole thing about radicalization and democracy settings. Virtually every society that underwent a process of democratization had to take the risk, had to take the stakes with who's gonna reach power. And the whole effort is to commit to the rules of the political game. That if a political player A or B or C reaches power and tries to sabotage the process and tries to damage the democratic setting, then it is the duty of the state to stop. And we have that. We already have that in Germany, for example, after the World War II. You can establish a political party and advocate whatever, virtually whatever you want to advocate, except for, okay, denying Nazism is, denying the Holocaust is something, but I mean in the ideas, in the political ideas, you cannot work against the democratic setting. You cannot advocate something that says no democratic setting. See, it's doable. But again, it's like the contexts are different. When you compare, this is why I always say numbers are not easy to read, and the contexts are different, the trajectories are different. Islamists in Egypt are not those in Tunisia, and Islamists in Algeria are not the same in Sudan, and the context really play a big part. Where the military is, where the military stands from civilian politics, and how committed the key players are to rules of the political game. So back to our theme, I just hope that the EU does not exclusively prioritize security at the expense of other highly valuable purposes, like democracy promotion.
If I may, let's go back to MENA countries. You talked about democracy. What democracy? You have Tunisia, who had only 2 presidents, only 2, since 1956. Only 2. And there were all democratic institutions, elections, parties, syndicates, whatever you want. All the features of democracy there were. And there were only 2 presidents. It's not democracy.
Well, this is why we say,
not,
yeah.
It's falsified.
Yes, and this is why we say alternation of power is key.
Okay, this is no democracy. The same goes for Egypt. Since it was Nasser, for 6 months it was General
Mohammed Naguib.
What? Then it was Nasser, Sadat, and since 1981 it was Mubarak until 2011. And every 4 years he gave the elections by 90% plus. This is not democracy.
Yeah, this is what when we talk about the EU and we say, yes, there are the settings in terms of institutions.
There are other kind of problems in Europe. There are 2 serious problems, but of another kind, because there are 2 different societies. There are too many problems in Europe, but there are too many problems in MENA region countries.
Sure.
In my opinion, you cannot have for 40 years the same president winning the elections by 90% plus.
Yes, but part
this
of
is impossible.
yeah, but part of
even
the
in Soviet Union you can reach this percentage.
Okay. You wanted to say something? Yeah. Wanted to say something.
Don't worry about it. Just a comment. If you say that these societies are not democratic, then the question is, can these societies have democracy really?
Of course they are.
Can they have?
Of course they are. But they didn't have the time. That's why it meant I was referred to, I don't know, Algeria, for instance. 1962, after 8 years of a really savage war.
So responsible is the West for the non-democracy
of course it is.
in the Middle East, you
Of
say.
course it is. But why?
Why?
Why? Because the West supported all these suppressive, repressive, and oppressive regimes just to secure their alliances.
Okay,
That's all. And the Soviet Union did the same. When Khrushchev visited Egypt, Egyptian communists were in jail, but really didn't mind. Why? Because he was in Egypt. He was in the heart of the Arab world. Egypt is not a country, just a country. It's the heart of the Arab world, in my opinion. So, of course, West is responsible.
Yes, but just a question about that.
Just not the West.
Not the only reason is not the West, you say.
The only reason, of course, is not the West.
Yeah.
But the West has a really...
But just a minute. The West has done a lot of bad things all over the world. I mean, imperialism is not just in the Middle East.
Colonialism.
Is in South America, is in Vietnam, is in Greece as well. We have just a bad experience by the Americans during the Cold War. But we don't have terrorism. We don't have extremism in Greece. Vietnam, for example, today has no extremism. It's pro-American Vietnam, although it was destroyed totally by the Americans.
But after the war.
So don't.
After Americans were defeated.
Were defeated, yes, but Vietnam, who was against America, now is not against America. It's pro-American. The basic foundations in Vietnam is pro-American. So we cannot give responsibility to the West for all the bad things happening in the Middle East. This is my opinion.
I'm not saying that.
You can accuse imperialism, of course. You can accuse colonialism. You are right about that. But I think you have to do more research and more deepen on these issues. Okay.
I did, and I said that the West is not the only one.
Okay, I really enjoyed the interaction, and I do think it's a very vivid and long-lasting discussion on what went wrong and who's to blame. Yeah, but But again, this brings us back to the why they hate us of 9/11, the idea that, yes, the West was actually not just responsible, but also was regarded, perceived by the populations in many times as the culprits in the suppressive and repressive practices in these countries. Why? I mean, my key point in the analysis that I published last year and I was presenting today with a little bit of addition is actually that the EU should look at the file of democracy promotion from the perspective of eliminating Islamist militancy, that they are not separate schemes. If the EU looks at democracy and terrorism as separate schemes, probably what happens today is going to happen years later, and it's going to continue. That security will be prioritized, democracy will be relegated unimportant or secondary or. But if they are brought together in association, that actually if you improve the lives of people in MENA countries, you actually, in a way, are eliminating terrorism because you are giving the militancy no soil to grow. Then maybe the EU will look differently and prioritize or reprioritize the democracy promotion scheme. So it's not just about democracy, it's actually about improving the daily lives of people so that they are not easily recruited by militants. That was my point. And thanks for your time, and I'm sorry for keeping you.
We thank you for your speech, your presentation. It was very, very interesting. Do you have any comment, any question? Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very insightful.
Present yourself, please.
Yes, of course. My name is Alexandros Michalopoulos. I'm a postgraduate student at the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. I'm currently writing my thesis actually for Orientalism too. So it was also a very helpful presentation. I would like to ask you, I will add to the discussion a nation, not an ism, like securitization. Maybe, I don't know, Europe and America securitize terrorism in order to keep stable the MENA region. And if you see that those measures, that if we can say that that's why we're not to give so much space for democracy and security is our only goal. That's what, I mean, do you think that this is also a reason or it's an overstatement?
Can you please repeat the last part? Because I didn't get which thing you think is an overstatement or is a reason.
If we're using securitization as an explanation, it's an overstatement. If it's, you know, a point that we deny to see, we say that we deal like it's not important. That's what I mean. Thank you.
Well, security and like maintaining security is never a problem or is never a challenge. It's not something that we can debate or argue whether it's needed or not. It is needed. Every human society needs security. You have something called the security establishment, and this includes not just the army but also the police force and the intelligence. Like any human society needs a security establishment. Okay, so if you say it's about securitization, well, the EU, again, is committed to its citizens, to its member states, with making sure that the societies are safe. This is nothing to worry about. The only thing we care for is that this is not done at the expense of democracy promotion, because at the end of the day, these work together. If people are suffering economically and politically, they will be easier preyed upon by the militants, yes, to be radicalized. So it's not a matter of security is important and democracy can wait. This is not how it works. If the EU, and the EU has cards to play. I already mentioned in the analysis, the ENC analysis, some examples of the funds and the assistance that's offered by the EU. And virtually, these funds and assistance schemes can be used in order to put some pressure to enhance, this is one thing, to enhance democracy promotion or to kind of promote democracy. And at the same time, if any effort is being exerted towards eradicating poverty and, for example, enhancing the infrastructure, to make sure that this is done properly, that this is done so that it really eradicates poverty, that it's not after billions of euros being gushed into MENA countries that poverty, millions of people are still under poverty line. So to see what is like, what's wrong with what is being done. It's kind of a refinement or an improvement, but there's nothing wrong with security. There's nothing wrong. As said, it's very interesting how the bulk of the monarchies in the Arab Peninsula are actually very safe. So if anyone would argue about the role of religion, we would say, look at the monarchies. The most conservative, relatively speaking, in the MENA region are actually the safest, or within the safest, like they are topping the list. And by the way, I didn't mention that, but for the Global Terrorism Index, you will find that at least one or two in the 3 years that I detected, 1 or 2 Arab countries usually made it to the top 10. Iraq was first in 2011, 2016, and second only in 2021. Syria and Yemen made it to the top 10 once or twice. So seriously, terrorism is a problem in MENA, and it's a problem for MENA countries as well as 2 neighboring countries and the EU.
Anyone? Well, so I have to thank again Professor Hussein for her interesting presentation, and you as well for your presence here and your comments. And I hope to see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you all.